Introduction. In 1989, the classic film When Harry Met Sally dealt with one thorny issue. Can a man and a woman really be just friends? That question may still be up in the air, but Hollywood took on a more fundamental one. With the 2015 film The Danish Girl. Can a man really become a woman? The answer from Hollywood was a resounding yes. The Danish Girl is based on the true story of Einar Wegener, a painter in Copenhagen who in 1930 became the first known subject of sex reassignment surgery. He had long thought of himself as having a female identity that he called Lily Elbe, but whether those drastic medical procedures made him truly a woman is another matter. The idea that a person could have been born into a body of the wrong sex and might be transformed into the other sex by surgery and hormones would remain marginal for some time. Now it is rapidly becoming a mainstream view that social and medical transition is the appropriate treatment for people, including children, who feel at odds with their biological sex. America is in the midst of what has been called a transgender moment. Not long ago, most Americans had never heard of transgender identity, but within the space of a year it became a cause claiming the mantle of civil rights. A discordant gender identity is said to represent who the person really is, by contrast with the sex assigned at birth, and therefore any failure to accept and support a transgender identity amounts to bigotry. We are told that not treating people as the gender they claim to be is discriminatory. But is it true that a boy could be trapped in a girl's body? Is our sex merely assigned to us? Can modern medicine reassign sex? What is the most loving and helpful response to the condition of gender dysphoria, a profound and often debilitating sense of alienation from one's bodily sex? Should our laws accept and enforce a subjective notion of gender? These shouldn't be difficult questions. In the late 1970s, Dr. Paul McHugh thought he had convinced the vast majority of medical professionals not to go along with bold claims about sex and gender that were being advanced by some of his colleagues. McHugh received a world-class education at Harvard College and Harvard Medical School. As chair of psychiatry at Johns Hopkins Medical School and psychiatrist-in-chief at Johns Hopkins Hospital, he put a stop to sex reassignment surgery at that facility in 1979. Many other medical centers across the country followed the elite institution's lead. But recent years have brought a resurgence of these procedures, not in light of new scientific evidence, mind you, but under the pressure of ideology. The people increasingly in the spotlight of the transgender moment are children. In 2007, Boston Children's Hospital became the first major program in the United States to focus on transgender children and adolescents, as its website brags. A decade later, more than 45 pediatric gender clinics had opened their doors to our nation's children. Parents are told that puberty blockers and cross-sex hormones may be the only way to prevent their children from committing suicide. Never mind that the best studies of gender dysphoria, studies that even transgender activists cite, show that between 80 and 95% of children who express a discordant gender identity will come to identify with their bodily sex if natural development is allowed to proceed. And never mind that transitioning treatment has not been shown to reduce the extraordinarily high rate of suicide attempts among people who identify as transgender, 41%, compared with 4.6% of the general population. In fact, people who have had transition surgery are 19 times more likely than average to die by suicide. These statistics should be enough to halt the headlong rush into transitioning and prompt us to find more effective ways to prevent these tragic outcomes. Most of all, we shouldn't be encouraging children to transition or making heroes and role models of those who have done so. In this book, I argue that Dr. McHugh got it right. The best biology, psychology, and philosophy all support an understanding of sex as a bodily reality and of gender as a social manifestation of bodily sex. Biology isn't bigotry. Every human society has been organized around a recognition that men and women are different, and modern science shows that the differences begin with our DNA and development in the womb. It is true that men and women differ among themselves, and that some people have difficulty identifying with their bodily sex. But this doesn't mean that sex is either fluid or subjective, as transgender ideology maintains. This book is an effort to provide a nuanced view of our sexed embodiment, a balanced approach to policy issues involving transgender identity and gender more broadly, and a sober and honest survey of the human costs of getting human nature wrong. The first chapter focuses on our transgender moment in three different realms: culture, law, and medicine. It looks at recent developments in popular culture that have changed American opinion on gender identity and legal developments during the Obama administration that redefined sex as gender identity. Then it examines how medical practice has shifted, with particular attention to Johns Hopkins, Dr. McHugh's institution. In 2016, pressure by transgender activists resulted in a course reversal there, away from good medical practice and into what is becoming a transgender affirmative mainstream. In a more disturbing story from Canada, a world-renowned expert on gender dysphoria had his clinic closed down by the government because he did not uncritically support transition therapies for children. Chapter 2 shines a light on the thinking behind these trends by letting transgender activists speak for themselves. It's important to note that most people with a discordant gender identity are not activists of any sort. But there are activists pushing a transgender ideology on the nation, and their views have greatly influenced how our society responds to gender dysphoria. The chapter begins with transgender ontology, the assertion that a trans boy is a boy, plain and simple, not a girl who identifies as a boy. Second, it looks at transgender medicine, the recommended 4-step treatment process of social transition, puberty blockers, cross-sex hormones, and surgery. Third is transgender policy, including access to sex-specific facilities and programs, the lessons that children are taught in school about gender, the criminalization of misgendering someone, and the provision of desired medical services. In all these areas, concerns about religious liberty, parental authority, and even privacy and public safety fall by the wayside. Activists tend to be uncompromising in their demands, yet their worldview is fraught with contradictions. It holds that the real self is fundamentally separate from the material body, yet insists that transforming the body is crucial for personal wholeness. It attaches a notion of authentic gender identity to stereotypical activities and dispositions, yet it grows from a philosophy holding that gender is an artificial construct. It promotes a radical subjectivity in which individuals should be free to do whatever they wish and to define the truth as they choose, yet it calls for enforced conformity of belief in transgender dogma. After listening to trans activists, we will hear from their victims. People who have transitioned and come to regret it. Chapter 3 presents the stories of several people who found that transitioning didn't bring the peace and wholeness they sought, but only new problems. The stories of detransitioners complicate the sunny picture frequently presented in the media. Many of these people recall a feeling of being pushed into transitioning, as if there were no other options, and they wish that medical professionals had made an effort to help them understand the deeper psychological issues that alienated them from their own bodies. Many regret the permanent damage done to their bodies, and some who transitioned as teenagers believe they were not mature enough to make such consequential decisions. Some feel that their dysphoria resulted from social hostility to people who don't conform to gender norms or who have same-sex attractions. In this light, social conservatives, including myself, should take care to be respectful and compassionate toward people we may disagree with. We should also call on transgender activists to stop trying to silence detransitioners. As this book went to press, The Telegraph, UK, ran a report with the headline, "Sex Change Regret. Gender Reversal Surgery is on the Rise, so why aren't we talking about it?" The answer to the question is political correctness. But it's better to be correct than politically correct where human lives are concerned. Chapter 4 lays out a foundation for understanding why the reassignment approach is misguided. Looking at the biology and philosophy of sex, it answers questions about our nature as a sexually dimorphic species, about how our development as male or female begins at conception, about the many biological differences that result. Contrary to the claims of activists, sex isn't assigned at birth. It's a bodily fact that can be recognized well before birth with ultrasound imaging. The sex of an organism is defined by its organization for sexual reproduction. Secondary differences between the two sexes, attributes that may be visibly altered by hormone treatment, are not what make us male or female. It's impossible even to make sense of the concept of sex apart from the ways our bodies are organized for reproduction. That organization starts to develop well before birth. Chromosomal and hormonal pathologies may disrupt normal development, though in fact these abnormalities have essentially nothing to do with transgender ideology, except insofar as activists want to relabel such abnormalities as mere differences in an effort to normalize disorders. Attempts to find biological explanations for discordant gender identities have come up short, as Chapter 5 explains. Notwithstanding the media hype over supposed differences in brain structure, there is no solid scientific evidence that transgender identities are innate or biologically determined, and there is some evidence that other factors are most likely involved. But in truth, very little is understood about the causes of discordant gender identities. Many psychologists and psychiatrists think of gender dysphoria as being much like other kinds of dysphoria or serious discomfort with one's body, such as anorexia. These feelings can lead to mistaken and harmful beliefs. The most helpful therapies do not try to remake the body to conform with thoughts and feelings, which is impossible, but rather to help people find healthy ways to manage this tension and move toward accepting the reality of their bodily selves. This therapeutic approach rests on a sound understanding of physical and mental health and of medicine as a practice aimed at restoring healthy functioning, not simply satisfying the desires of patients. Children especially develop best when parents and professionals help them understand and accept their embodied selves as male or female. Chapter 6 focuses on gender dysphoria in children and the experimental therapies that have rapidly become commonplace. As recently as 2012, The Washington Post reported that the very idea of labeling young children as transgender is shocking to many people. Starting a young child on a process of social transitioning followed by puberty-blocking drugs was virtually unthinkable not long ago, and the treatment is still largely experimental. Unfortunately, many activists have given up on caution, let alone skepticism, about drastic treatments. They assert that puberty blockers are safe and reversible, but in fact these drugs carry long-term health risks, and development occurring at age 16, that usually happens around age 10, cannot be considered normal. There are potential psychological consequences, too, since blocking puberty may interfere with the developmental mechanisms that normally help children accept themselves as male or female. A more cautious therapeutic approach begins by acknowledging that the vast majority of children with gender dysphoria will grow out of it naturally. An effective therapy looks into the reasons for the child's mistaken beliefs about gender and addresses the problems that the child believes will be solved if the body is altered. Dr. McHugh finds that other psychosocial issues usually lie beneath the child's false assumptions, and his therapy focuses on remedies for those issues. Chapter 6 concludes with case studies of children who received effective therapy that offered strategies for accepting themselves. An effective treatment plan for children will help them develop a more nuanced view of gender, so they understand that real boys and real girls don't all conform to narrow stereotypes. But this doesn't require adopting the view that gender norms are purely social constructs and hence artificial and oppressive. Chapter 7 traces our cultural gender confusion to its roots in gender theory and in certain strains of feminist thinking about our embodiment. First-wave feminism was a campaign to liberate women from an overly restrictive concept of gender so they could be free to fulfill their nature, but it gave way to a movement seeking to make women identical to men. From the era of inflexible stereotypes, our culture swung to the opposite era of denying any important differences between male and female. The result is a culture of androgyny and confusion. An agenda of nullifying the distinction between men and women might seem opposed to the insistence on the absolute reality of transgender identity, i.e., an inner sense of being truly male or female, yet both start by severing gender from biological sex. Between stereotypes on the one hand and androgyny on the other, the virtuous mean is a view of gender that reveals meaningful sex differences and communicates the difference they make, a view that takes sex differences seriously while upholding the fundamental equality of the sexes as complements to one another. It acknowledges what sex differences mean for marriage and family, for friendship and education. Our sexual embodiment is precisely what makes marriage possible, and a host of social practices, including how we nurture boys and girls, are shaped with the good of marriage in view. On average, boys and girls, men and women have different needs and inclinations, so our law and culture should not take the male way of being human as the norm. This means that women should not be forced to live, work, and compete as if they were men, which is what some people would prefer, with proposals to ban stay-at-home moms. Society should accept that men and women may, on the whole, have different preferences and freely make different choices. From the realm of culture, we turn in Chapter 8 to law and public policy, covering issues like access to single-sex facilities, pronoun policing, and health care mandates. There are 5 distinct areas of concern surrounding such policies. 1. Privacy interests when men who identify as women can enter female-only spaces. 2. Safety concerns when predators abuse gender identity access policies. 3. Equality concerns when biological males can compete against females in sports and other arenas where sex differences are relevant. 4. Liberty interests when people are forced to speak or act in ways contrary to their best judgment and deeply held beliefs. And 5. Ideology concerns about confusing messages that school children receive when they are taught that gender is fluid, falls along a spectrum, and is essentially detached from bodily sex. Children are especially vulnerable, so we must do everything possible to protect them and provide an environment that fosters healthy development. We need to respect the dignity of people who identify as transgender, but without encouraging children to undergo experimental transition treatments and without trampling on the needs and interests of others. And we need to acknowledge that taking our sexual embodiments seriously in public policy is not discriminatory. Transgender ideology may appear to be establishing a firm place in our culture, yet there are signs of defensiveness among its advocates, as if they realize that their claims are contrary to basic self-evident truths. The transgender moment may turn out to be fleeting, but that doesn't mean we should expect it to fade away on its own. We need to insist on telling the truth and on preventing lives from being irreparably damaged.